Thank you, Jerry. Yeah, thank you. I am Kélig Delumeau-Prigent. I am a French developer living in San Francisco. And yeah, first of all, I'd like to thank you, Xpin and Jerry, for having me here talk online about this topic that's really dear to my heart called Design Systems Ops. And so this talk is going to be in a few parts. As Jerry said, there's going to be a Q&A at the end, but in the meantime, I'm going to start with a bit about my story, and then we're going to talk more about Design Systems Ops. I'm going to start with an aside. What are design systems? When I'm going to be referring to design systems today, it's going to be in that context. I really like this presentation, this kind of diagram, the Venn diagram of all the things design systems by Nate Baldwin. There's that URL at the bottom. He wrote great articles about design systems and what can be in a design system. So as you can see on this Venn diagram, there is the style guide at the center. And as you get outside of the style guide, you get into things like brand and content strategy, visual design language, UI kit. These are super important things that we're not going to talk about today, but they are very dear to my heart as well. And the place where I really like to play is processes, dev standards, and the kind of component delivery mechanism. Documentation is also super important. We're going to touch a tiny bit on this. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of give you a lay of the land of what I mean by design system when I'm talking about it today. As an introduction, I'd like to start with this sentence. As building our products becomes more and more complicated, we need to ensure our tools are up to the task at hand. But we'll get back right to that. Now, story time. So I started in 2007 at a company called LunaWeb. So about 10 years ago, it was a very small web agency. I was employee number 2. And as you do when you're in a very small agency, you do a bit of everything from server maintenance to project management to actually going in front of clients and doing user research, front-end design, UX support. And as we started hiring more and more back-end and designers, I decided that I wanted to specialize in UX and front-end. As being a psychology university dropout, I still had this interest in like the users and research and how do we make the best experience possible. And I noticed as we were making a ton of websites, our churn rate was really, really, really high. That we kept repeating over and over the same things. So I started building boilerplates for building emails, building websites, building static websites that then we could really easily port to our like a real production Rails application. And as we get better at doing this internally, we actually started selling it to customers, to big brands in France that saw the value in front end and didn't really have the internal skills to do it themselves. So we would build something before Bootstrap existed, something a bit like Bootstrap for a big customer. Then after 5 years, I decided that I needed to speak English in my workday. I was really tired of this French to English translation between code and work. And also I wanted to work on products, like really pour a lot of love into one single product. And this is something that you never necessarily have the chance when you're in a small web agency to do. So I started at BBC News in 2012. They were rebuilding their news website to be a responsive site. So I was part of the BBC News core team. And I also had the chance to work with the BBC GEL, the Global Experience Language, which is their design system over there, on a BBC-wide responsive grid, which was pretty innovative at the time. And also introduced things like BEM, which is kind of a component-driven methodology in CSS. And I also initiated a component library called Guts, Getting Up to Speed, which was enabling anyone to prototype quickly. this is what BBC News looks like. It doesn't look like much from a design perspective, but when you think of it, it's delivered through a really powerful platform that is translated in something like 20 plus languages. There's a ton of people working on this project. It's a really interesting machine to see at work. And this is the GEL website. I really encourage you to have a look, because this is something that the BBC does really well. It's a really massive company, and they have so many different sub-brands like news, sports, weather, Earth, travel, BBC radio, all of that needs to kind of have this BBC brand. And so they do it really well with their global experience language. So I had the chance to work on this, the grid. It was a really good experience. And then I moved to The Guardian, which is, again, a British news website. It also happens to be a newspaper, but I was working on the website side of things. They were also doing a responsive web redesign. And the context was a bit different. There was 3 teams working on theguardian.com, kind of in a very high level of autonomy. And everybody could touch the CSS Sass code base, which, if you've built websites at this scale before, you can tell that 20 people touching the CSS can be a challenge sometimes. And the fast pace of iteration meant that it was very hard to build a component library or like a design system that was all-encompassing of all our components, because the design was changing so fast that staying up to date more than 2 weeks would have just been impossible. So this is what it looked like when I arrived, and this is what it looks like today. You can tell there's a big difference between those two. This is by the fact that small iterations led to this amazing homepage. And as you go into the different pages of the website, so this is a story, an opinion story. This is a video story about Edward Snowden. Sorry. And so you can tell these are pretty different templates, but at the same time, you can feel that Guardian touch. And what I did over there is that I decided to abstract away the super small parts of our design language. So the core principles behind our design language, which are the grid, the media queries, so the breakpoints, typography, etc., into different Sass components that could be reused by all of our different teams. And so, for example, in that case, I wanted those Sass mixins to speak the same language as the designers. And if you read this CSS, it reads almost like English. This block's width on a tablet and up is 3 grid units. And pretty much anybody could understand what this is doing. And the goal here is that if a designer is sitting down with a developer, they could have a really fast pace of iterating on the design without the developer having to understand how the grid works, what the grid width, what the grid units mean, etc., what the breakpoints are. It would be really, really fast to work directly in the browser, sitting down with a designer. It's all open source, so I encourage you to have a look if you're interested in seeing how like a pretty big Java Scala project can be done. And the Guardian style sheets mixins are also open source, so you can check it out on Guardian Gus on GitHub. This is a few things that I'm not going to go through, but you can ask me questions about how we bridge that gap at The Guardian between developers and designers. And this is also when I started talking a lot about this, because I was really passionate about how we can leverage Sass, which is a pretty simple tool in itself. It's a CSS preprocessor that allows us to kind of make CSS awesome. And this is something I got really passionate about, and I wanted to talk about it. And so yeah, I became kind of this advocate for bridging the gap between designers and developers. And this led me to the Financial Times, who heard of me and heard of my work and wanted to see if I could reproduce what I did at The Guardian at the Financial Times. The Financial Times is the leading financial news online and offline as well. It's a great place to, if you're a banker or if you're in finance, it's a great place to get your news. And the challenges at the Financial Times were that there's a ton of websites over there, a ton of different stacks. Experts were needed everywhere. They put the bar really high in terms of JavaScript, CSS, accessibility, etc. And that meant that we couldn't afford to have developers reinventing the wheel, testing over and over again the same things. And the culture was unfortunately dominated by engineers. There was very little space for design at the time. And so the solution over there was a framework called Origami. Origami is a set of tools and services that allow people to get stuff done at scale for to solve these problems. It's a set of high quality reusable components that are built upon a spec. It's also a set of tools to build and use those components, like CLI tools, etc. Services to deliver those components using a CDN and using Bower. And it's also based on the idea that engineering teams are kind of in a free market model. The Financial Times, likes the free market economy in some way, but internally it worked well as well. That means that anybody could use or not use Origami. There was nobody forcing you to use that set of components, that design system. And anybody is also free to contribute to it. If you want to know more about how Teams as a Service works and how this free markets model can be applied to engineering teams, there's a link down there in the notes. So this is what Origami looks like. You can tell here that this has not been designed by designers. It's a very kind of developer-centric approach to showing what a design system is. But it's almost like marketing at this point. It's not just a reference website. It's a little bit of marketing. This touch that says it's, these taglines that below Origami. It says unifying branding across FT digital products, making development better, faster, stronger. And this is because Origami was in competition with things like Bootstrap, I guess. So for people to want to use Origami, my team needed to really focus on selling it. Origami is composed of a ton of documentation on how to build components and even how to write documentation for Origami. So this is interesting, and you can find all of this at origami.ft.com. This is the documentation about documentation. It's also a component library, so it's the registry of all the components. It's kind of like an NPM registry at this point. And as you dive deeper into the components themselves, you can find a ton of information about all these colors, all these fonts, but also buttons, comments, footer, header, etc., etc. And the interesting part over there is that the core, so let me go through it. Okay. The core team was curating those components, was also documenting and evangelizing the best practices around web performance, accessibility, also building tooling, building examples, and making sure all the services were working well by monitoring them. And this team was also going to train designers, developers, and product managers to think in systems and teach them how to also have an input on this system. On the other side, the product teams, the users of Origami, could not only use it, but contribute to it, just like on any NPM package, for example. You could fork something, you could create your own, you could publish it to the registry, as anyone would do on NPM and GitHub. You could build your component for your own product, but you could also contribute to something that was already built and extend it for your own use case. And third-party companies that were building marketing websites could also consume that really easily because everything was open source. Then my wife moved to California, and I decided I might as well follow the wife. And I ended up at a company called Salesforce, which is a CRM company. And Salesforce has been pretty well known in the design system world for its Lightning design system. So I joined that team and really enjoyed a lot of interesting challenges there in terms of scale, especially. Salesforce is about 25,000 people. And a lot of the teams writing front-end code were not necessarily experts at it. There was a ton of inconsistencies everywhere, lack of reusability and accessibility. Designers would constantly chase assets and reinvent the wheel as a result. People would not necessarily know where icons were, illustrations, loading screens, sketch files. There were a ton of stacks as well, because Salesforce was acquiring a lot of companies at the time. And each company would have its own technology stack. And partners were asking, how do I build Salesforce apps that looks like Salesforce? So just like there's an app store on Android and iPhone, the questions, there's the same thing on Salesforce. Think of Salesforce as a big operating system in the cloud. And the partners were bet their business on building apps for Salesforce, and we're asking, how do I build something that looks exactly like Salesforce, that blends into our ecosystem? And the solution was a few different phases, but the first phase was design tokens. There's a lot of documentation about design tokens. If you want to read more about it, I don't have time to get into it, but essentially they are abstracting away the fundamentals of design across platform. They are the subatomic parts. If you think in terms of atomic design, they're the subatomic parts of your design. Their colors, spacing, breakpoints, etc. The second idea was to deliver HTML and CSS, pure HTML and pure CSS, so that any acquisition who had their own tech stack, any customer, any partner, or internal team could decide what to build upon. HTML and CSS are here to stay, but React and other web components or different internal frameworks come and go all the time. So building for the long term, HTML and CSS was part of that solution. Another thing, document all the things. If it's not documented, it does not exist at this scale. You need to document a lot of things, making sure it's very clear in terms of design principles, patterns, best practices. And another decision was to share and maintain a Sketch UI kit that anybody could use inside and outside of the company that was up to date with the latest components and the latest look and feel of the Salesforce Lightning experience. So my team's role at Salesforce was all around automation, trying to find ways to get better at testing, at linting, at how could bots like Slack bots or things like that help us to smoothen up our process. Continuous integration and continuous development were stuff that we were very passionate about as well. And a big challenge was to integrate our delivery process of the Lightning design system with the core platform, which essentially means that the Forge.com website, which is the big Salesforce platform, needed to consume the design system in a way that was really easy for them. We were doing a lot of operational work around GitHub, open source, NPM monitoring, etc. And we catered for trying to make a better developer and designer experience in terms of tooling, but also in terms of prototyping environments. How could we get our ideas as quickly as possible to the browser? So this is an example of a chatbot here on Slack that would tell us, hey, you forgot to put release notes in your pull request. Did you mean to do this? Maybe you want to go back to your pull request and have a look at it. So it would ping you directly on Slack to tell you, hey, that's something you might want to think about. And at the bottom here, it will also remind you to merge branches together when needed. So this is a prototyping tool. I don't really have time to go through all of the tools that we were building, but there's some interesting things. This is also the UI kit. Theo is an abstraction that transforms design tokens to many different languages. So if you need your design tokens to be consumed by a SaaS stack, or maybe an iOS stack, or maybe an Android stack, that was what we were using. It's open source. Feel free to use it. We would be mapping all of our release processes in a way that would make sense for everyone, because we had a slightly unusual release process. So we wanted to make sure everybody was aligned on this. So we would just map that, print it out, making sure everybody was up to date with what was going to happen. Monitoring was very important. Just want to make sure your design system and all your services are always up, and that you get alerted if they go down. And something that's been really interesting and announced very, very like a few weeks ago, is you can build validators in Chrome using a Chrome extension to make sure people on the product side are respecting the rules from your design system. So in that case, you can see in the top right hand of the screenshot, the follow button is highlighted. That means that there's kind of a mismatch between how the design system's been built and how the design system is used in the product. This can be super useful for people who are implementing the design system. And then it was time for me to move on and to look at other opportunities. And Shopify was the most interesting place for me in terms of what I thought I could learn and have an impact at. And they, at the time, were just releasing Shopify Polaris, which is their design system. And their design system is very unique in a way that it really takes content really, really seriously. And copywriting is one of the angular parts of this design system. It's a really interesting thing that definitely caught my eye. And so my team over there is called UX Systems. I'm part of a sub-team called the theme over there, called UX Acceleration. So UX Acceleration is kind of what we're going to be talking about, which is DevOps for designers and engineers in the UX department. We're building tools and services, and we cater for the developer experience of people using and contributing to the design system. So to reframe a little bit what DevOps is, I found this great quote from Jeff Susna, and he says that DevOps is reducing the distance between people, teams, and activities, combined with reducing the batch size of your work, which allows you to deliver more value, more continuously, with greater quality. And I've underlined the words that really resonate to me: people, teams, activities, more value, continuously, and quality. This is what DevOps, but also design systems ops, is all about. So about a year and a half ago, I wrote an article about design systems ops and what it meant at Salesforce. And at the time at Salesforce, it was kind of, I would say, definitely a role. But it's been brought to my attention that maybe it should be considered a practice. And in bigger teams with a lot of engineers that are really well integrated in the kind of the delivery process and not separated from designers, I would say, yeah, it's definitely a practice. But for now, I don't really have an answer. I'd say that it's probably a practice, but that some people need to champion it. And what is design systems ops all about? Well, all you need to ask is, when the end result, which is the code, or an experience that you get through code in the end. We're all shipping code at the end of the day. When the end result is a poor representation of the original intent, which is the design, where does the process fail our users? Where does the process fail our users? Well, what I think is that we want to reduce decision fatigue with a frictionless delivery process. This allows people to spend their calories on the creative stuff. If you spend less time making decisions all day, you can spend more time on being creative and making decisions where it really matters, where the value for the company and for the user is. So what kind of decisions can we make for our users as design systems ops? For example, design meets performance in many ways. You could ask, what's the best way to load assets? For example, fonts. If you're on the web, what's the best way? If you're in a single page app, what is the best way? Should you use service workers? Should you just use the latest font loading APIs in CSS? What about iOS? What about Android? What about your design tools? If you're a designer, what font do you have to download? What font do you have to use? Do you have to ask around on Slack to many people who have been here for a long time? Or do you have just a download link during your onboarding process, or maybe on the design system website that gives you exactly the fonts you need to work in Sketch, Illustrator, etc.? What about loading SVGs? Do you use IMGs? Do you use SVGs with a path in it? Do you use SVG sprites? Do you base64 them in CSS? All of these could probably be documented somewhere for like, what is the best way to do this depending on the context, instead of having to ask ourselves those questions, which have a huge impact on performance. And then if you want to be good at performance, you need to be good at image optimization. And this is, again, a place where if you're a designer and you deliver an SVG to a developer, or if you deliver a PNG to a developer, what happens to this image? What happens to this artifact? Do you need to manually optimize it? Is it going to be automated? Is it being served through an image service? If you don't know that, if you have to ask around all the time, what is going to happen to my image? It's a huge waste of your time. Again, this should probably be documented in a way that makes sense for people building product, but also for people using the design system. In terms of developer experience, I feel like local development environments really can very, very easily get hard to run, hard to install. And so you want to ensure that you get a fast setup that is fast to run, that running yarn start or npm start or whatever your stack is takes only a few seconds, and that the cost of running your local development environment means that it's so low that it means that anybody can start prototyping, iterating, fixing stuff without them thinking, oh, wait, I need to block at least 5 minutes for it to install, for it to run, and then maybe I can start iterating. Because people will just start ignoring it and they will stop fixing stuff on a regular basis. Another thing is live reload. Like if I save my CSS file, do I have to refresh my browser, or does it refresh automatically? Which is, in terms of iteration time, a huge time saver. What about linter configurations? I see teams constantly debating on semicolons and where should spacing be. This is not a good use of our time. This is something that a good tooling can solve for us, and good documentation as well. So this is the kind of stuff that design systems ops can cater for, so that the developer experience is seamless and you don't even have to think about this. Again, this is reducing decision fatigue. What about releasing? In terms of, so you make a change to the design system, you open a pull request, it gets merged. What happens then? That release process, how transparent should it be? I believe that if possible, you should have a single button release process. It's one of the best ways to have something that's really fast to put in place. But also, it means that if you make a mistake, it's really easy to fix it in production as well. What about loading JavaScript and CSS in products? This is something else around asset loading and performance. And what about building a new component? That's the kind of stuff that is really interesting. You see emerging patterns in different products, and you want to make sure people know how to take them to the next level into your component library. So in terms of testing, testing is really important, and a lot of design systems team kind of bypass it. So as a developer, can you run all the tests locally? Do you have to go get a coffee until those tests finish, or can you just run them really quickly? Visual regression testing, also called p-diffing or perceptual diffing, is really interesting, where if I make a change, some service is going to take a ton of screenshots of all the components or all the pages of my design system and come back to me to tell me if I made any changes that broke other components. So let's say I'm changing the padding on a button. I want to know if I'm breaking all the forms in the design system, or if that affected exactly what I wanted to affect. So you can have a visual regression testing service for that, and that's super powerful. Accessibility is really important, especially in America. We have laws that say that your website should be accessible, and at Salesforce, that's something we took very seriously, and same thing in the previous companies I worked at. Automation around accessibility can be a huge time saver. It's really hard to be an expert at accessibility testing. And some hurdles like alt attributes and titles and area roles can be automatically tested by some, just accessibility automation. So there's a few tools for that, like Axcore or Pally. And they kind of all suck in their own way, but if you put them together, you can get a pretty good baseline for accessibility. And again, that Chrome extension that I showed you earlier, I feel like this is the kind of stuff that we need to explore a bit more, so that end users, the product people, the product builders, have the certainty that they actually are respecting the rules set in the design system. So I'm not going to cover, I couldn't cover everything in this, like this is not an exhaustive list of what design systems ops can help with. You can help with design tooling as well. You can help with content tooling, making sure grammar rules and brand, like voice and tone, is respected in your files across your products, etc. This is the kind of tooling that you can build, but we don't have time to cover it today. So I'm just going to jump into the next step and say, where do you start? Like, what are the first steps to get your design systems practice in place? Well, I feel like if you don't know how people are using your website, it's hard to know where to start. So first thing is to do some user research, put out some surveys that are going to try to answer a few questions, at least get you a lay of the land of, so do some starter research. You want to know what tools and languages are people using. And you want to know if developers are using React or WordPress, because that's going to have a huge impact on knowing how to where to put your efforts in. If they're using Rails, how comfortable they are with HTML and CSS, what IDEs they use, because maybe you can build some plugins for their text editors. In terms of design, you want to know if they're using Sketch, Abstract, UXPin, Craft, all of these tools that are a huge ecosystem right now. It's hard to keep track. There's so many, and you want to know what people are mostly using. Something that is interesting is, where do they get blocked? What do they not understand? Where do they lack skills, or maybe transparency on how something goes to production on the design system side of things? And Git is a common one. Rebasing is very scary for everyone. So maybe putting some training in place, or maybe giving them a user interface on their in their editor would help them. And also, you want to know who are the casual design system users versus the experts. That's going to be helpful to find allies across the company that can also feed back to you some interesting, field feedback on like what the hurdles were to using the design system. But also they can sell it to their team if they find that this new version of the component X is really good. We should totally upgrade our product to use it. They're going to be the ones that are going to help you do that. Then you want to measure and monitor. So for example, you could put some analytics on your design system site. Google Analytics is great for that. You can kind of track where people are clicking around, if they're downloading your Sketch UI kit, how many clicks. Also, you want to monitor your build time. So developers don't like to wait. You don't want to waste their time. We're paying them a ton of money in the Silicon Valley. This is not so that they have to wait for your CI to build in a pull request. So you want to monitor that to make sure it doesn't go completely crazy. You want to monitor the number of technologies that are currently leveraging the design system, and maybe the number of technology that potentially exists in the company that could leverage the design system. The number of pull requests, plus the time to answer and merge those pull requests. Something else that I think is really interesting is the MTTR, the mean time to repair. So when there's a change, a fix to be made on the design system, how long does it take for that change to go down to production? This is going to be a huge revealer of how seamless your process is and how easy it is to ship your design system. In terms of quality, you can check for linting errors, accessibility issues, and check that number and see if it goes up and down, because when you start putting linting into place, typically there's quite a few warnings. So you want that number to go down, not up. So then once you have a good lay of the land, you've got some metrics in place, you're measuring what's happening from this baseline, you can emit a bunch of hypotheses, a few questions that you have that you think that maybe changing the place where the button is to download the UI kit is going to increase the number of downloads on it, and you feel like this is going to solve your problem where people keep asking on Slack, where is the Sketch UI kit? So you could come up with those kind of questions, hypotheses, and then act on it. You also want to target your impact where people already spend their time. You don't want to force them to learn new tools for the sake of it. This is the mistakes that people in DevOps tend to make, is that they introduce new tools instead of going directly to where people already spend their time. So you want to help them reduce the time to execute existing tasks, not having to change their workflow too much. Unless it makes really, like you think it's a really huge value to your process, don't add new tools. And what I would say is that your success should be measured on the problems you solve, not the number of tools you put in place. Now you want to ask yourself what success looks like for the business itself. What's the mission of the business, and how your time can be best used at that level. So kind of taking a 30, 50,000 feet view of what you're doing and what it means for the business. Is your time better suited to fix those linting errors that you've seen, or is it putting tools in place so that people know they should fix those linting errors where it makes sense? I'm almost at the end of this presentation, and I'd like to put a little aside on tooling acceptance. Tell people what you're going to do and how you think this will help them. This is a really big problem in companies where people are ingrained in their ways. People will develop a resistance to new things. Not everybody is ready to jump on the latest version of every single tool. It's really hard to make sure that people understand this is for their own good, but it's definitely worth it. You don't want people come at you after you've put an amazing workflow into place, and they're like, why do I have to do all these new things? That it worked before, and now you're telling me I need to do all these things, and I had to do an npm install and broke my workflow, and I've got all these feature branches that I'm working on. And so anyway, there's so many ways that this could go wrong if communication is bad. So definitely think about tooling acceptance before you put things into place. And I'm going to end with a few last slides, give you a few thoughts to reflect on. If a design system is a product, serving product, how do we shape it so that it's desirable, respected, maintainable, beyond taste and technology. How do we make sure it serves both the interests of the company and the interests of the people using it and contributing to it? That's what Design Systems Ops is all about. Thank you very much. And I'd like to mention that Shopify is hiring. If you're interested in building awesome tools and services on the Polaris design system and work with me to help the UX systems and UX team at Shopify, we're about 200 to 300, depending on how you count. But yeah, we're trying to help those folks get shit done. And so get in touch at kelly@shopify.com. Yeah, we pay well. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Kaylee. Yeah, that's fantastic, and we definitely have some questions. Before we dive into the questions, I'll go ahead and launch our poll right now. Well, actually, I'll just drop a few quick mentions. So here is Kaylee's email. Let me just drop it here in the chat so you guys have that for reference. Kaylee@shopify.com. And of course, if you're at all interested in checking out UXPin and our design systems capabilities, we have a free trial as well. And I'll drop the link in there. And also our Slack team. If you have more than 3 years of experience on a product team, we encourage you to apply. So there's a few links there for folks to check out. And I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll and get right into the Q&A. And so one question here, this is a very important question that always comes up, is in your experience starting out, how would you recommend somebody document their design? So this particular person is using Confluence and Sketch, but they're finding that that effort is rather redundant. Based on your experience, is there a certain workflow that you found to be particularly useful?
That's a very good question. Yeah. Well, I feel like documenting design itself is something that is super important, but it doesn't scale on its own. I like when there's also a component library that's a living, breathing artifact of what people should use in their products, such as React Component Library, something like that on the side, so that it's not just pretty pictures, but also like a great interactive place to look at what the design system looks like in action in a browser, for example. Now, in terms of Confluence, okay, so a lot of people are using WordPress to document their patterns. That's because design teams are very comfortable with it. I totally understand. Yeah, I would recommend to do wherever people are spending their time already is good. Introducing a new website can be quite a bit of work. Yeah, I mean, there's so many ways of documenting your design. I'm not sure. I think Material Design does a really good job because they have this central place that's all about the design, and then satellite website that's multiple implementation of it. But I don't. Yeah, I think it's kind of a hard answer, a hard question to answer on the spot. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. Next question is around visual regression. So you talked a little bit about that. Have you found any useful tools or processes for visual regression testing?
Yeah, so you can integrate visual regression testing in your existing workflow, such as, so for example, every time somebody opens a pull request, you could set up a webhook that starts up a visual regression test that checks that your components are okay with the baseline. Like essentially it's doing an image to image, a pixel to pixel comparison against the baseline, which is, for example, like the current version of the design system. So that's super useful. In terms of tools, I don't want to do any publicity to any companies right now, but that's the kind of stuff that Salesforce we were building in-house. Same thing at BBC. At BBC, actually, they built something that is open source, so you can check out their BBC News repository organization on GitHub and check it out. But there's a ton of tools right now that allow you to do that. I'm pretty excited about Chrome Headless or Chromium Headless, because it allows us to have a modern browser to take screenshots in on our continuous integration processes. And that's super exciting, because before we were stuck with stuff like Phantom and like super outdated browser engines. So I think it's going to get better and better, and I'm hoping that it becomes a community very soon, because some platform as a service or service SaaS models are helping us doing that more and more. So yeah.
Great. And the next question here is around governance. So you talked a little bit about how you handle governance of technology, for instance, linting CI/CD. How does Shopify handle governance with design? So for instance, iterating the styles and UX interactions and migrating those changes into Polaris.
Sorry, say again the last part.
So this person is curious about, how does Shopify handle governance of design? So for instance, if there's certain iterations of styles and interactions, how are those changes migrated into Polaris?
Oh, right. That's a good question. That's actually something we're trying to figure out right now. We're a team of more than 20 people, I would say, and we're trying to divide the work in themes. So as I was saying, my theme is UX acceleration, and there's another theme that's around emerging patterns, trying to figure out what the new patterns and what the iterations on existing patterns are, and trying to see how they would fit in the current system, and then retrofit them into our multiple implementations. So we have a Rails and a React implementation right now. So we're thinking about that. It's going to be a collegial activity. I think it's going to involve many people. We don't want to bloat the design system with a ton of stuff that would only serve one product in particular. But if we see something like, I don't know, maybe an improvement on the date picker that's going to help us with localization in term, that's definitely something we'll want to have in there. So we don't have a clear process yet, is the answer, basically.
Right. Now, back at Salesforce, how was that handled? Was that something that was already in place when you were there?
So at Salesforce, it was a bit simpler in the sense that pretty much every pattern was in the design system.
Oh, got it. Yeah, that definitely helps. And the next question is, again, this is another interesting governance question, which is, in your experience, how do you make sure that all of the different teams use the components correctly and not some Frankenstein version of it?
Yeah, it's a really big problem. So at the Financial Times and at Salesforce, we were distributing CSS in a way that's really easy to update. But the problem was the views, right? Because you're shipping HTML, so you don't have the insurance of people copy and pasting the HTML well, or even adding the JavaScript hooks, all the area roles and all that very well. So that's a really, really big challenge. One of the ways to solve it is to actually review literally every feature by the design system team. So that's what Salesforce does. There's a design system review at the end of each kind of big iteration, where every team comes and presents their stuff to an accessibility specialist team, as well as the kind of component builders, to make sure that if there's big errors, they're notified to fix it. And then, so I was showing let me go back to it. Okay, I think that's here. Yeah, right here. So in this slide, I don't know if you can still see the slides, but I was showing a dev tool panel built by the Lightning Design Systems team that basically in the product allows you to check if you're respecting the rules set in the design system itself. So that's the kind of stuff that can be super useful in terms of scaling, so that instead of taking people's time and doing like a full review every release, you pass your interface into that tool, and it gives you quite a good lay of the land of like what's valid and what's invalid.
Gotcha. Someone here is curious about structure in the design system. So they wanted to just get your thoughts on, do you think a design system always needs a dedicated team to create and maintain it? Or can that responsibility be shared across different product teams as part of their workflow? And then as a secondary question to that, they're just this person's also wondering, is there a certain size at which you feel that a company really needs a design system team?
Yeah, it's a recurring question that almost everybody I'm talking to is wondering about this. I understand that it's really hard to ask for funding on something that's not actually producing any kind of, it's not releasing to production immediately. So especially in scrappy startups, investing in the design system, I can see how, especially in a team, I see how it can be really hard. However, there's a certain size at which you have multiple developer teams and they're starting to work on the same thing without even knowing about it. And my question is, can you afford not to have a design system? And then can you afford not to have a design system governance team, or like at least shepherds of or champions around this project? I feel like you don't necessarily need a team, but if people are pulled into some context switching from product to system to product back to systems all the time, they might not be super efficient at directing the design system very well. So I'd be in favor of having, I mean, if it works for you, great, but I'd really be in favor of having at least one or two people dedicated to design systems at sizes of, I don't know what the size could be, to be honest. It depends how many products you have, how many, like if you're working on one big product, maybe it's not necessary because you have one code base, you can build it from there. If you have, let's say, 3 code bases, then maybe it starts to be interesting to have somebody to overlook what's happening in terms of design and patterns across all of these things. But yeah, I don't think there's a mathematical way to solve this. Maybe Nathan Curtis would have better ideas on this, so definitely ask him on the design system Slack.
Yep, and let me drop in the design systems Slack here, actually. I'll find that in a minute. And then let's go to the next question, which is... So perhaps you could speak from how Shopify is currently structured. This person is curious, what is the typical structure of a design systems ops team in terms of the different roles there? And what's and in your experience, how is that team usually structured in terms of like number of people and also the roles and breakdowns and between their responsibilities?
Yeah, so I think you probably, so at Shopify, we're a UX systems team, and we cater for all the implementations of the design system, which is right now Rails and React, and we also have people focusing more on illustration, icons, the design aspect of the admin side of Shopify, as well as people looking at emerging patterns I was talking about. And my team, and also we have content strategy, which is embedded in our UX systems team. And my team is dedicated to UX tooling and services, so UX acceleration. And so the way we're structured right now is there's me, I'm kind of the advocate for developers here. We have a designer, we have a content strategist, and we're hiring one front-end developer and one designer very soon. So reach out. The way it worked at the Financial Times, which I think worked really well, but it lacked a bit of design. I think now they have a designer on the team, but it's people who have a deep understanding of web technologies and were very dedicated to building like a strong platform-based scalability model where the team builds services and tools and caters for like the really, really super basic components. But I think in Design Systems Ops, you mostly want to focus on tooling, services, processes. My job, for example, is not to tell people how to, like, what the color of the button is. That's totally not my job. So I feel like it doesn't necessarily need to be a full separation in different teams. It could be like a practice, like I was saying, where everybody's kind of doing it. But in my team, I'd like it to be have some people who are strong at building APIs, CLI tools, maybe looking at how we could build playgrounds for prototyping, that sort of stuff. I think you still need some content strategy and designers to kind of advocate for the needs of those people in our UX team. We're also going to try to bring some researchers to help us with research, but not full-time for sure.
Right. And since we are coming up on the end of the hour, we will take just one more question here. This last question will be about front-end technology and tooling. So someone is wondering, how should they go about evaluating the best front-end technology for components like React, Angular, Ember, Vue.js, etc.? Do you have a preferred technology stack, and how did you go about finding the right one?
I do have a favorite technology stack, but I mean, betting on the web and the web standards is rarely a bad idea. So in my really long-term vision, I'd like everything to be web components, but right now the tooling is really poor, and the understanding and documentation are really poor as well. So it's not that trivial to implement. And at Shopify, there was a really big front-end technology survey that's been done and research. And we ended up on React. As we were also migrating our API to GraphQL, it made sense. But I don't know, it feels like if you want to hire easily, React is definitely the way to go. It's super powerful as well. So, but I'm not here to promote React, so I don't know, depending on what your company has been using in the past. And as a design system, shipping React components is pretty useful as well, because you can keep your API clean while changing the internals, whereas if you ship HTML and CSS, the consumers of the design system have to update the HTML and CSS all the time because the HTML is your API. So it's a tough one. I'd definitely recommend doing some research internally and not following anything I've just said or whatever you read online about what the best framework or library is. I don't believe that. Just do your own research.
Got it. And yeah, on that note, I think we will close out the session here. Thank you, everybody, for joining today's session. Kayla, you did a great job. Thanks for sharing some of your experience and your advice.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, no problem. Absolutely. And next week, we will have Sophia Wojciechowski talking about object-oriented design, which is a pretty useful methodology for approaching modular design. And of course, related to that is design systems. So hopefully see some of you folks there as well next Wednesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time. And meanwhile, I'll drop in the link one last time for our Slack channel. If you have more than 3 years of experience, feel free to apply. And with that being said, yeah, thanks again, everybody. The slides and the recording will be sent to you by next week. Yeah, that way you guys have it for reference. Caleb, yeah, take care.
All right, take care, everyone.
All right, see ya.